Hello, everybody. I'm Peggy Sundstrom, and I'm delighted to be your host for this research symposium presentation by Christian Tekwe. Christian's topic today is grit and small business survival among African immigrant entrepreneurs. So we're excited to have you join us today and excited to see Christian's presentation. We will have the chat function open throughout the presentation, so please feel free to post your questions and comments there. In about the last 5 minutes of today's presentation, Christian will address those questions for us. So let me tell you just a little bit about Christian. Christian has a vision of empowering minority communities through small business entrepreneurship. He's a doctoral student here at Ashford University. I'm very happy to say one of my doctoral students, and has just finished his dissertation in organizational development and leadership. His presentation today is based on that research and the findings from that study. Trained as a certified registered nurse anesthesiast, Christian also owns and runs an anesthesia services business in Houston, Texas. Apart from his medical career, Christian also has management experiences in coaching, real estate investment, and agribusiness. You could say he's a consummate African immigrant entrepreneur himself. Christian, welcome. Looking forward to your presentation. Take it away.
Thank you, Dr. Sundstrom. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And it's a pleasure to be here to share my research with everyone present. So the topic of my dissertation was exploring grit among sub-Saharan Africa, the influence of grit on small business survival among sub-Saharan African immigrants in the United States. So I'll be looking at the background of the problem, just a brief review on the sample, the data collection procedures, the findings of the study with some discussion, and then I'll embrace the significance in terms of the research and actual practice. So why are we interested in this issue of survival among sub-Saharan African immigrants in the United States? Immigrants as a whole do start businesses in large scale. They get into entrepreneurship in good numbers, but they also exit at a higher rate compared to their native peers. What is also interesting is that those from the sub-Saharan African region, in spite of their high human capital, tend to have very low rates of entrepreneurship. And the literature has very little information, interestingly, about this subset of the population. They are treated in the general Black minority population in the United States. And here it is interesting to note that both federal and state governments have been interested in promoting entrepreneurship within the immigrant community. But also the fact that studies have shown that communities with a high rate of entrepreneurship do have political representation, which could also be a channel through which they can reinforce some of their needs and have representation within the broader community. So the question is, here we wanted to find out what are some of the mechanisms, what are some of the criteria that could help us better understand survival of small businesses within these communities. In order to do that, we came up with a conceptual framework that considered both grit and small business survival. Grit is a concept that has been propagated by Angela Duckworth from the University of Pennsylvania, looking at consistency of interest and perseverance of effort in the long term. It has been shown within different professional settings to correlate with performance in the long term. And then small business survival is a criteria better suited also for measuring performance within the immigrant community, because it responds to their unique criteria, the motivation, and their journey as newcomers within the host communities. So we wanted to look at the different criteria that are also unique to their experience, considering ethnocultural factors, immigration integration, the experience through which they settle into the host communities, and also human capital. So what guided our research, therefore, was in line with those factors, looking at grit, ethnocultural factors, immigration integration, and human capital, and how these affect the survival of the business within this community. So I think I might have had a skip there. The sampling of this study was primarily based on sub-Saharan African immigrants in the Houston metropolitan area. We used what we call non-probabilistic sampling, looking at those who've been in the country for greater than 10 years. They must have been over 30 years of age, and they must have owned their businesses for 5 years as well. We made sure that the sample was well represented and that it reflected the diversity that was indicated in the literature. And then in terms of data collection, we looked at, it was comprised of two components. The first was a grid scale, and then the second was recorded telephone interviews. In terms of grid scale, this grid scale was divided into two subcomponents: perseverance of effort and consistency of interest. The participants could score anywhere from 1 to 5 on the grid scale, 1 being not greedy at all, and 5 being extremely greedy. The telephone interviews were recorded, transcribed, and then coded for material or themes that would reflect greed also, but embedded within the questions on greed were these factors that would, we're looking to see how these factors of ethnocultural factors, immigration, integration, and human capital influence the experience of greed within the entrepreneurs from this community. Findings, again, in line with the research questions, starting with greed, we combined both the results from the grid scale and the subcomponents of consistency of interest and perseverance of effort, as well as the data from the transcribed interviews. In the first place, we realized that the participants were greedy. It means to say that they scored high on the grid scale. But when we divided the subcomponents of perseverance of effort and consistency of interest, it was interesting to note that across the board, all the participants scored at the same, the perseverance of effort score and the consistency of interest. The participants scored more on the perseverance of effort score than on the consistency of interest score, except for one participant who had a perfect score of 5, therefore the same score for the two subcomponents. Here we were interested in determining if this score, a slightly lower score on the consistency of interest, had to do with a level of non-commitment or inability to stick to specific goals on the part of the participants. Recall that we said in the earlier, in the introduction, that they start businesses at a higher rate, but they also drop out, they quit also at a higher rate when compared to the non-immigrant entrepreneurs in the United States. When we looked at the gender, it was also clear that the female entrepreneurs scored just a little bit more than, their scores were a little bit higher than those for the male entrepreneurs. But in terms of the perseverance of effort score, as well as the consistency of interest sub-scores, although the male participants scored a little bit higher than the females on the perseverance of effort score, the females were, their score was majorly higher. It means to say that they score way higher than their male counterparts when it came to the consistency of interest score. And as we said before earlier on, it might be a component of the shortfall in terms of the ability to get consistent or stick to a specific set of goals when it comes to running their business. So here it might be that the females tend to be more consistent when it comes to their businesses. In terms of age, participants who were 40 to 50 years of age scored highest on the grid scale, followed by those who were 50 plus. In the literature, this is reflected in the literature, which had indicated that greed increased with maturity and age. And so, and that it also plateaus at a certain level, which is probably consistent with what our findings here indicate. Greed and country of origin, those from Cameroon had the highest score with 4.7 on the scale, followed by those from Nigeria, 4, and those from Kenya, and the Kenya 3.7, and the Democratic Republic of Congo with a score of 3.1. This is also validated in the literature. Here, I must mention that there is no specific criteria indicating why some countries would score high on the grid scale or would perform better in terms of their businesses in the long term, but that has been demonstrated in studies in Israel and in Spain among immigrants. When we looked at the coded material from the transcript, we realized that in terms of consistency of interest, the participants expressed a sense of autonomy, that is to say the desire to want to run the businesses along lines of what they would choose to do and how they intended to express themselves in business and entrepreneurship. They also indicated that other-centeredness was a strong theme. That is to say that they were interested in running their businesses because they thought that it was a means for them to give back to the community and also and that helped them sustain their interest in the long term. Some of them also talked about running their businesses as a function of a mission in life that they had developed, as well as a vision in terms of expressing themselves within the unique capabilities that they think they have to offer to the broader community. In terms of perseverance of effort component, the participants talked about having developed adaptive strategies in line with constructs such as a sense of purpose, personal values, and tenacity. And when we combine that with the grit score components, which indicated that perseverance of effort scores were significantly higher than consistency of interest, one would imagine that the motivation, the internally driven motivations were significantly higher, or they weighed more on the scale when compared to extrinsic factors of motivation with regards to this specific population subset. When we looked at the ethnocultural factors and the effect on small business survival in the long term, the participants expressed the fact that their belonging to a specific culture or ethnicity and enhanced their sense of identity and drove purpose and performance. They talked about the desire to want to run their businesses in line with the perceived expectations of their community in terms of social validation. One of the participants talked about the fact that she was quite aware that she needed to succeed because the community is looking up to her to succeed as an example for the rest of them to follow. They also talked about the emphasis on work ethic, a strong work ethic that they developed within their community. This was quite interestingly strong among the participants. Almost all of them, about 90%, talked about the sense of work ethic that they developed growing up within their communities back home in Africa. They also talked about the socially supportive values in terms of community, a sense of oneness, and also the internal values of self-reliance, the sense of knowing that they have to count on themselves to succeed as having been a component of their culture and ethnicity. In terms of immigration integration, the participants talked about the fact that in spite of the challenges that they faced, the process informed and prepared them for entrepreneurship in terms of developing survival skills and persistence in running their businesses. That some of them mentioned the fact that businesses, being an entrepreneur was a challenge, but they have gone through challenges through the immigration process, and they can have hope because they know that in spite of challenges, success is always something they can look up to. They also talked about developing social competency in terms of through their experience through the immigration and integration process. Some participants talked about modeling their behaviors from observations of other Caucasian or other minority community businesses. One of the participants talked about using the experience that he had through a small community in rural Kentucky in terms of the relationships he was able to build within that community to mirror the way he was handling both his clients as well as his employees. And that to him has helped him to sustain performance in the long term. Participants also talked about the enhancing interpersonal skills in terms of empathy and communication. Significantly, most of the participants who talked about this had businesses that impacted their own communities, their own immigrant communities. So they are able to respond to and modulate their services to fit the needs and expectations of their community. In terms of human capital, the participants talked about previous experience and education as having been significant in terms of their ability to sustain interest and persevere in the long term. They talked about bringing forth developed and enhanced interpersonal skills that they had in their businesses, especially one of the participants, Bella, who runs a pharmacy business, said when she was a paid employee, she was involved in the hiring and training and conflict resolution. And so she has been able to bring that forth into her business now as an entrepreneur. They also talked about bringing along with them technical skills, specifically skills that were related to their industries, similar to the case that I just mentioned about Bella, but also one of the participants who runs a coaching business that she'd been working with someone else before, and she's been able to carry that same and mirror it in the way he runs his current business. They also talked about other aspects, technical aspects in terms of specific managerial skills, analysis, as well as procurement when it comes to goods and services and market analysis. In terms of education, the participants talked about the personal values that they had developed in terms of their experience, through the going through school, going through the different courses. They became more patient and they focused attention. One of the participants talked about his experience as a PhD student and how that helped him to develop patience, focused attention, and also the confidence of knowing that whatever they learned in school, these for participants who had carried forth their experience, the content of what they learned into their businesses. Their businesses were reflecting of what they learned. They felt more confident because they could defend challenges or even answer a lot of questions that came from their clientele. Okay, they also talked about technical skills coming from the educational background. This specifically for those who had earned MBA level education, brought along with their management skills, also learn how to start and run a business. And also some of them talked about auxiliary skills that they learned from school, like theater arts as a minor, and being able to use that in managing the stage for conferences, especially one of the participants, Antonia, talked of running a conference for women empowerment based on that experience. So what are the what's the significance of these findings? In terms of research, primarily, this is one of the studies, a few studies that would have looked at grit as a qualitative measure in context, apart from Datu's study among Filipino students, but also grit in combination of entrepreneurship in contexts that have not been looked at in the literature, specifically grit in the context of a minority community, immigrant entrepreneurship, considering these different factors as described in the conceptual framework, and also looking at grit, dividing into the components and seeing how they would be interpreted in terms of their effect on performance and gender. And it also gave the opportunity for the researcher to look at the possibility of exploring, of designing grit scales that would target specific communities instead of a generic grit scale that may not reflect the realities of some population subsets. And this study as well is one of few studies. It's actually the first in the literature so far that has dedicated specifically the topic of entrepreneurship within the sub-Saharan African immigrant population in the United States. In terms of practice, entrepreneurs who might be interested in from this community to venture into small business ownership could learn from the challenges and the experiences, as well as the motivations that have proven to be successful within this community. The findings from this study were unique to this population, so it might also help stakeholders who are interested in the promotion of entrepreneurship within the community. And also, just as we saw before, it is possible that from the findings of this study, the promotion of entrepreneurship could consider the variations among between the gender in order to be much more specific and targeted. So that's the end of my study, and I'll entertain questions at this time.
Slash UORDS. Hello, everyone. It looks like we may have lost Dr. Sundstrom. I'm sure she will be logging on momentarily. Christian, thank you so much for your excellent presentation. Really fascinating research. And I am looking in the chat for some questions, and then there's some great feedback. One question that we found from Dr. Deborah Bowman is, did you find other confounding factors that impact success or failure of the immigrant entrepreneur that you were unable to include as part of your thematic analysis or outcome, but are still critical in your opinion? And I know that's a long question. I can repeat it if you'd like.
Oh, no, thank you. I think that was it was very clear. It's an interesting question. And yes, I did find some factors that could have affected the survival or performance of the entrepreneurs. However, the challenge was that I present the findings that I'm presenting fell within the, and probably you've already realized that within the framework of the conceptual framework of the study. So some of the findings that some of the challenges that I found were financing, funding their businesses upfront was a major issue for the entrepreneurs. They also talked about discrimination. They talked about challenges within their own community, not being able to get the kind of support that they could get when trying to hire members of their community. So in terms of startup, they also talked about not having the knowledge to start a business, as typical businesses will be run in the broader community in the United States. So yes, there were quite a few findings that came out of the study that I was not able to integrate with the findings that I just indicated in this presentation.
Thank you, Christian. That's great. Another question from Dr. Bowman asks if the SBA or other organizations offer specific support to the immigrant business owner.
Yes, there are some programs generally to minority populations, even within the SBA, but nothing that I could find that was specifically targeted to the immigrant population. I am not sure why that was the case, but there are programs for minority business. If an entrepreneur could identify themselves as a minority business owner, there were some programs, as well as within specific communities. Like I mentioned before, state and federal governments have programs that targeted immigrants as a whole. There was one in New York City and one in Chicago, or New America, something, as well as other non-governmental organizations like the Kaufman Foundation that have programs in terms of education and capacity building for immigrants in the United States.
Thank you, Christian. And with just a couple of moments left, a couple of other questions are, Dr. Karen Ivey is asking if were your study participants located in different U.S. geographic locations?
No, I used only the sample from the Houston metropolitan area. I did not locate other participants beyond that geographical setting. So that's the answer to that question, unfortunately.
Thank you. And again, just one more minute to go. I'm scanning to see if I missed anything. Shira Jones is asking if you looked at what type of business, for example, laundromat, store, mechanic shop, etc., was associated with grit and success.
Very interesting. I know I did not look at that, and my data could offer a little bit of a window into that area, but I did not look at that. And that's interesting because my data offered the possibility to look at grit scores in terms of business industry. I did not look at that specific area, and that's something that would be interesting to look at, to see if grit was associated, the scores of grit could be correlated with specific industry subtypes. That's an interesting question, and I'm going to look into that as well.
And I apologize for dropping out. I lost my internet, but Christian, just in the few seconds we have left, you say you have a vision of empowering minority communities through small business entrepreneurship. How are you going to take this message on the road and share it with others?
Thank you very much, Dr. Sundstrom. I already belong to quite a few African immigrant community organizations. Some of them I am leaders within that those organizations. And I usually have presentations about issues about a community. I already started, even before I did my research, because it's my area of interest, entrepreneurship, to talk about investment opportunities back home in Africa, as well as in the United States. And I also started a collaboration with one other guy who has a web-based social media platform he calls Africa Bond. And I told him about my study, and he was very excited. He thought that the members of his forum may be interested in the findings of our study, that we could do some kind of a presentation online and answer questions, in order to help them become, improve their capacity as entrepreneurs in the United States. So there are quite a few possibilities for me, and I am very excited about the options, both to present my findings in a way that is relevant to the community, as well as do a lot of research, such as the question that was just asked previously before you came on board.
Right. Yeah. Again, sorry I missed out on this. Just one last comment, and I know we're out of time, but Dr. Esteville commented that it looks like supporting female entrepreneurs among sub-Saharan African immigrants would be a pretty good investment. Are there regions or countries in the sub-Saharan area where small business ownership is embraced by the state?
Small business embraced by the state. That's a very good question overall, looking at female entrepreneurship. Unfortunately, because of cultural and ethnic pressures and perceptions, the female entrepreneur is still one of the findings, literature researches that I found was a study in Ghana, where female entrepreneurs, they themselves felt like they were not capable of becoming better entrepreneurs because of the perception that the community had over their abilities, or even their roles within both the family and society. So there's still a lot of challenges, but I'll take the advantage of Rwanda, where the government has been very proactive and does actually have 60% of his government, of Paul Kagame, the president of Rwanda. His government is composed of women. So women ministers in government, and also the way he promotes entrepreneurship is really raising the bar for the females to come on board. And I'm sure that we've all seen recently the findings of the COVID-19 response, showing that countries with female presidents tend to be responding better than those run by males. So this is not new, but it just raises the question as to whether we're given enough space for women to really show their true strengths and abilities.
That's wonderful. Christian, thank you so much. Wonderful presentation. Really appreciate your time today. And we will have this available online. So thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Dr. Sundstrom.
Thank you, Christian. Bye-bye.
Bye.